Hi there, my name is Andrew Huang, and my proposition is that inherent segregation in cities affects all the citizens negatively. And in particular, I'll be explaining how segregation has affected the city of Chicago negatively, where the city in the last century previously institutionalized segregation by limiting its African American citizens to the south side of Chicago, effectively creating ghettos. And these ghettos have existed from the past century onwards to today. And then the measurement of segregation can be found by the spatial proximity index, which measures the concentration of people based on their race. In Chicago, the spatial proximity of African American white segregation is 2.1. This is much higher than the national average of 1.4. The Metropolitan Planning Council found that that Chicago is the fifth most segregated city in the United States based on the combined racial and economic segregation of cities. My first main claim is that segregation is expensive for the city. First off, segregation causes African Americans and other minorities to have a lower income. The Metropolitan Planning Council found that if the levels of economic and African American white segregation are reduced in Chicago, the average income for African Americans would rise by $2,982 per person. Secondly, segregation reduces income for cities. The Metropolitan Planning Council also found that the levels of economic and African American white segregation were reduced in the city of Chicago. The Chicago region will earn an additional $4.4 billion in income. And third, segregation reduces the GDP of the city. The Metropolitan Planning Council also found that if economic and African American white segregation were reduced in Chicago, the Chicago region's gross domestic product would rise by $8 billion. My third main claim is that segregation causes lost potential in its residents. Segregated neighborhoods often have a higher rate of homicide. In 2016, more than half of the city of Chicago's homicides occurred in just 11 communities, and these communities were predominantly people of color and home to the city's highest rates of poverty. Segregated neighborhoods have less economic opportunity than the average. According to the report by the Chicago Reporter, the unemployment rate for blacks was 25% in Chicago, while for whites it was just 7%. The Metropolitan Planning Council found that if economic and African American white segregation was reduced in the city of Chicago, the unemployment rate for the city would drop down closer to the national average. Also, residents in the segregated neighborhoods are less likely to participate in higher education. Violence has a ripple effect. Residents in segregated neighborhoods are less likely to participate in higher education. It was found that if segregation was reduced in cities, more Hispanics and African Americans were likely to participate in the higher education process. And then third, the violence has a ripple effects in the city. It removes residents from communities by death and incarceration, and it unravels families and traumatizes survivors. And there's an investigation by the National Institute of Health found that in Chicago's Cook County Hospital, which hospital that receives thousands of gunshot victims each year, 4 in 10 patients showed symptoms of PTSD. In contrast, an investigation from ProPublica found that recent veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan's wars, soldiers' rates of PTSD was 1/3. PTSD is linked with many socioeconomic factors, and if rates of PTSD is higher in a city than it is for a war zone, there's something going wrong in the city. And then my third main claim is that segregation negatively affects housing. Segregation negatively affects the real estate values of homes. If regional homicide rates were 30% lower in the city of Chicago, in 2010, residential real estate value would increase by at least $6 billion. And then secondly, segregation results in higher costs for policing and correctional facilities. If homicide rates were 30% lower in Chicago, the region would save $68 million in policing costs and an estimated $218 million in correction costs. And total segregation is very expensive for the city. It causes lost potentials in its residents, and it also negatively affects the city's housing. And in conclusion, I hope that after everything I said, my proposition is that having segregated Segregated cities will hold a negative effect on its residents. Thank you.
All right, Andrew, the propositions identified, I'm not exactly sure there's much controversy on this. The argument assumes that segregation is a bad thing. I think most people agree that that's not a good thing, that it has led to negative consequences. The question that I have concerns why segregation exists. And I think that you tried to give us an explanation that it goes back to dozens and dozens and dozens of years ago, maybe decades ago, where minority communities were isolated. But the conditions have changed dramatically since then, so I'm wondering why they are still isolated in this particular way. If it's an economic issue, then that's one problem. If it's a social choice, that's a different issue. If it's related to some of the things that you talk about, that's that makes it more complicated. There's a lot of hypothetical stuff in the research that you're talking about. If we did this, then we'd have this. If we did this, then we'd have this. If we did this, then we'd have this. And I'm not saying that research is not accurate, but the question is, well, how do we get to any of those kinds of things? It's like saying if people would stop killing each other, we'd have less crime. Well, yeah, that's true. So my question is, how do we get people to stop killing each other? What is it that we need to do to change the segregation in the city of Chicago? I have no idea. There's only a vague hint as to where it comes from in the first place. There's no explanation as to why it continues. I think there's some economic issues that probably explain it, but you don't really talk about those. You talk about what the consequence would be if we change those economic issues. But how you change those economic issues, to me, that's where the controversy is. There's not much dispute that having groups of people isolated from other groups of people is going to be problematic. And in particular, it's problematic in the ways that you talked about. There's no organizational preview at the beginning of the speech, which becomes problematic because when you get into the body of the speech, I counted 4 number 3 points in a row. That's really confusing. So I didn't know whether or not these were distinct pieces of information that are all related to the same number 3 point, whether or not there were 4 different points that you were trying to make. That was problematic, and I think you have a tendency to rush through the information, and you're just reading data without explaining what the inferences are. So I think that's a little bit problematic. At the end of the speech, you kind of come back and make this argument that's more general about other cities, and all of your example is Chicago. So my question then becomes, well, it sounds to me like these problems are peculiar to Chicago. Where's the data that supports the same kinds of problems in other cities? Do they not have that kind of segregation that's going on there? Do they not have those similar kinds of problems? Is it just a particular ethnic group, or are there multiple ethnic groups that have these sorts of issues? The correlation to segregation, I think, is a pretty strong one that you've got here. But like I said, to me, the controversy concerns why the segregation exists and what we could do about it. The rest of it is just, statistical correlation. You're not going to deny that those correlations exist. All right. Thank you.